Clint Eastwood stepped into the courtroom, calm and composed, when Judge Barnes smirked and said, "Mr. Eastwood, this isn't one of your old westerns. You're irrelevant here." The room went silent. Eyes darted between them, tension thick in the air. But Clint, he didn't flinch. He just leaned forward, that signature squint in his eyes, because he had a plan. What he did next shook the courtroom, exposed corruption at the highest level, and ended a judge's career forever. Stay till the end, because this story, it's justice served the Clint Eastwood way. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The gavel struck the wooden bench with a sharp crack, demanding silence. The tension in the courtroom thickened as Judge Malcolm Barnes leaned forward, his lips curling into a smug smirk. His voice, slow and deliberate, carried an air of condescension. "Mr. Eastwood," he drawled, adjusting his robe as if settling in for a performance, "this isn't one of your old westerns. You're irrelevant here." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The plaintiff's lawyer stiffened, his hands clenching the table. The corporate executives being sued sat back in their chairs, sharing amused glances. A few journalists scribbled furiously in their notepads, sensing the birth of a scandal. And Clint? He just stood there, still, unshaken. His weathered hands rested casually at his sides, the deep lines on his face unreadable. His presence, though calm, carried the weight of decades. A man who had stared down villains both on screen and in real life. Judge Barnes let out a chuckle, leaning back in his chair. "What's the matter? No clever one-liners? No dramatic monologue? You may have been something once, but in my courtroom, you're just another old man wasting my time." A few people in the gallery chuckled, though it was nervous laughter. Nobody wanted to be caught openly siding against Clint Eastwood, but the judge, he didn't care. He was untouchable. Clint's eyes flickered to the plaintiff, a small business owner named Daniel Hayes, whose livelihood had been crushed by the very corporation now sitting smugly at their defense table. Hayes looked at Clint with desperation, hope flickering in his exhausted gaze. Clint inhaled slowly, then exhaled through his nose. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but it carried through the room like a gunshot. "You done?" The chuckles stopped. Judge Barnes's smirk faltered, just slightly. He squared his shoulders, giving Clint an unimpressed look. "Excuse me?" Clint took a step forward, his boots clicking softly against the polished floor. He tilted his head, sizing up the judge like a predator studying prey. "You got your little joke in, made yourself feel big. Now I'm asking, are you done?" The room held its breath. Even the corporate lawyers shifted uncomfortably. Judge Barnes scoffed. "Mr. Eastwood, if you think intimidation works on me, you're sorely mistaken." Clint finally moved, just slightly, resting a hand on the wooden railing before him. His fingers tapped once, twice against the polished surface. His gaze, steel and unwavering, locked onto Barnes like a rifle scope. "You sure you want to do this, son?" A shiver ran through the room, though the air conditioning hadn't changed. Judge Barnes clenched his jaw, but there was no hiding the flicker of unease in it. The judge opened his mouth, about to respond, when the courtroom doors swung open with a bang. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension, the kind that settled deep into the bones of those paying attention. Judge Barnes, still leaning back in his chair, scoffed at Clint Eastwood's unshaken demeanor. His smirk widened as he tapped a finger against the wooden bench. "This is a court of law, Mr. Eastwood, not a movie set," Barnes said, his tone dripping with arrogance. "You have nothing of value to add here." The corporate lawyers exchanged smirks, their expensive suits barely creasing as they relaxed into their chairs. The lead defense attorney, a man named Raymond Kessler, let out a short, amused breath before straightening his tie. They had already won in their minds. This was all just theatrics. Clint didn't flinch. He adjusted the lapels of his jacket, slow and steady, before finally speaking. "I reckon I'll let the evidence speak for itself." He glanced at the plaintiff's attorney, James Holloway, who immediately stood with a file in hand. "Your Honor, we have irrefutable proof that—" Barnes raised a dismissive hand, cutting him off mid-sentence. "Denied." A murmur ran through the crowd. Holloway frowned. "Your Honor, you haven't even reviewed the documents." "I don't need to," Barnes said, shaking his head. "This evidence is inadmissible." Clint exhaled through his nose. Not in anger. No, that wasn't his style. It was something more dangerous, a calm that came before a storm. Barnes leaned forward again, eyeing Clint with the same dismissive glare he had given him since the trial started. "You see, Mr. Eastwood, you may have spent decades playing a hero on the big screen, but in this room, I'm the law. A few chuckles echoed from the defense table, but they quickly faded when Clint didn't react. He didn't frown. He didn't argue. Instead, he simply tilted his head, studying Barnes the way a lion studies prey before pouncing. You done? Clint asked, voice even. Barnes narrowed his eyes. Excuse me? Clint sighed, his fingers tapping the railing in front of him. That evidence? It ain't just some piece of paper you can brush off. His voice remained low, steady, carrying a weight far heavier than the judge's gavel. And if you won't let it speak, guess I'll have to do this my way. The room went silent as Clint reached into his coat pocket. Barnes stiffened, his smirk faltering for the first time. The tension in the courtroom was a living thing, thick, heavy, and suffocating. Every eye was locked onto Clint Eastwood, who remained as still as a mountain, his expression unreadable. Judge Barnes, however, was the opposite. His fingers drummed against his bench, his jaw tightening. Mr. Eastwood, Barnes said, voice forced and measured, if you think you can intimidate this court, you're sorely mistaken. Before Clint could reply, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom suddenly swung open with a loud bang. The sound echoed through the chamber, turning every head toward the entrance. A young woman stood there, clutching something in her trembling hands. Her face was pale, beads of sweat forming at her temple. Her brown eyes darted around nervously before she took a deep breath and stepped forward. Your Honor, she said, voice wavering, I have something you need to see. The bailiff, sensing the weight of the moment, moved toward her, extending his hand. She hesitated for a moment, then placed a small USB drive into his palm. Judge Barnes straightened, his eyes narrowing. Miss Decker, he said slowly, recognizing his own court clerk. What are you doing? Jessica Decker swallowed hard but didn't waver. I can't stay silent anymore, she said. Play the video. A murmur ran through the audience. The corporate lawyers stiffened. Barnes, for the first time, looked genuinely unsettled. I will not allow random theatrics in my courtroom, Barnes snapped, slamming his gavel. Miss Decker, you are completely out of... A voice cut through his protest. This court will decide that, came a steady, authoritative tone. Judge Raymond Holloway, the federal judge overseeing the trial from the back of the room, stood up. His presence had been quiet up until now, but his words carried undeniable weight. He adjusted his robe and gestured toward the bailiff. Play the video. Barnes turned sharply to him. You can't be serious. I'm very serious, Holloway interrupted, his gaze ice cold. The bailiff nodded and inserted the USB into the court's display system. The massive screen at the front of the courtroom flickered to life. At first, the footage was grainy, dark, the sound muffled. But then, clear as day, the image sharpened, revealing a hidden camera's footage. Judge Barnes was seated at a table inside a dimly lit restaurant. Across from him sat Raymond Kessler, the lead defense attorney. And then in full clarity, Barnes's own voice rang through the courtroom speakers. Just get me the money and I'll make sure this whole thing disappears. The room froze. The air drained from the space as if a vacuum had sucked out all the oxygen. Barnes turned ghost white. The murmurs turned to gasps. Then outrage. Reporters in the gallery scrambled for their phones. This is a violation of privacy, Barnes roared, his voice cracking. This is enough, Judge Holloway interrupted, his tone like a whip crack. This court will now take a brief recess while we process this new evidence. Barnes's lips parted, but no words came out. He was caught. Clint leaned back in his chair, finally allowing himself a smirk. Reckon that was relevant enough for you, Judge? The courtroom was no longer just a room. It had become a battlefield. Judge Barnes's grip on his gavel tightened as the damning video footage continued to play, his own voice echoing back at him like a ghost from which he couldn't escape. Just get me the money, and I'll make sure this whole thing disappears. A sentence so simple, yet so powerful. It was the sound of a man sealing his own fate. The reaction in the room was instant. Gasps, shocked whispers, reporters frantically typing on their phones. A ripple of electricity ran through the air as the weight of what had just been revealed settled onto the spectators. Barnes's face, already drained of color, flushed an angry red. He slammed his gavel down with a sharp crack, but this time the sound didn't restore order. This is a violation of court procedure, he barked, his voice shaking slightly. That video is inadmissible. From across the courtroom, Clint Eastwood slowly leaned back in his chair, completely unfazed by the judge's outburst. He adjusted his jacket, tilting his head ever so slightly, before speaking in that slow, measured drawl that had made him a legend. Seems like we found something relevant after all, don't it, Judge? A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. Even the plaintiff's legal team, who had been struggling against Barnes's relentless stonewalling for weeks, now sat up straighter. This was the moment they had been waiting for. The plaintiff's attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named Lisa Caldwell, immediately rose to her feet. "Your Honor," she said, her voice strong and unwavering, "in light of this new evidence, we formally request that you recuse yourself from this case immediately." Barnes's head snapped toward her, his eyes blazing. "Absolutely not," he spat. "This is my courtroom. I will not—" "Your Honor," another voice cut in, this one calm but firm. All eyes turned to the prosecution table, where District Attorney Paul Henderson had just stood up. He adjusted his tie, his expression unreadable. "I would like to motion for immediate judicial review of this case." The courtroom erupted into murmurs. Judicial review? That wasn't just a slap on the wrist. It meant higher courts would now be watching Barnes's every move. It was a direct challenge to his authority. Barnes's lip curled. "You can't do this." Henderson met his gaze without blinking. "I just did." The weight of the moment hung heavy in the air. Barnes looked around, desperate for a way out, for anything that could put him back in control. His gaze darted toward the defense table, but even the corporate lawyers who had been so confident moments ago were silent. And then, from the back of the courtroom, a new voice spoke. "I think I'll be taking over from here." The room stilled. A federal judge, Judge Raymond Holloway, stood up, adjusting his robe. He had been sitting quietly in the gallery the entire time, watching, waiting. Now, as he stepped forward, there was no mistaking the authority he carried. Barnes's jaw clenched. His fingers twitched on the gavel. His career, his power, was slipping away before his very eyes. Clint finally stood, his towering presence commanding the room. He adjusted his coat, looked Barnes dead in the eye, and smirked. "Now ain't this a plot twist?" Judge Barnes swallowed hard, but the fight in his eyes wasn't gone yet. He wasn't going down without one last dirty move. The courtroom was suffocating with tension. Judge Barnes gripped his gavel so tightly his knuckles turned white, his entire body stiff with rage. He could feel the eyes of the entire courtroom burning into him. Judges, lawyers, reporters, and spectators alike, all watching as the empire he had carefully built over the years crumbled around him. "This trial is over," Barnes snapped, slamming the gavel down. "I am dismissing this case immediately." But before the final crack of the gavel could echo through the room, Judge Raymond Holloway raised a hand. "That won't be necessary, Malcolm," he said smoothly. Barnes looked up sharply. Holloway's expression was calm, but his tone was like steel. The weight of a higher authority had just entered the room, and Barnes knew it. The federal judge adjusted his robe, stepping toward the bench. "I've just reviewed the motion for judicial review," he continued. "Given the overwhelming evidence of misconduct, I'm officially removing you from this case, effective immediately." The courtroom erupted into murmurs. The legal teams whispered frantically among themselves. The media reporters scribbled at lightning speed, and even the jury exchanged shocked glances. Barnes's face darkened. "You don't have the jurisdiction." "I do," Holloway cut him off, his voice sharp. "And let me be very clear, Judge Barnes. Your actions have violated the ethics of this court, and this trial will proceed without you." The gavel in Barnes's grip trembled slightly. The panic creeping into his eyes was unmistakable now. In the back of the room, Clint Eastwood finally stood up, slow, deliberate. His presence alone was enough to shift the atmosphere. He adjusted his coat, locking eyes with Barnes. "You can't buy your way out of this one, Malcolm." A hush fell over the room. Barnes's nostrils flared, his jaw tightening. The confidence, the arrogance he had just minutes ago was gone, replaced by something dangerously close to fear. The moment stretched, thick and unyielding. Then Barnes slowly leaned forward, gripping the edge of his bench as he met Clint's unshaken gaze. His lips curled into a bitter, hateful sneer. "This isn't over." But Clint just smirked. "It never is." Barnes clenched his fist beneath the bench. If he was going down, he was taking Clint with him. The tension in the courtroom had reached a boiling point. Judge Barnes sat rigidly in his chair, his mind racing for a way out. His palms were slick with sweat, but he kept his expression neutral, forcing himself to breathe evenly. He wasn't finished, not yet. He still had power, still had connections. He could make a few calls, pull a few strings. There was always a way out. At least, that's what he thought. A loud buzzing sound broke the silence. The bailiff, standing stiffly near the judge's bench, pressed a finger to his earpiece, listening intently. A beat passed, then another. And then, his eyes widened. "Your Honor," the bailiff said hesitantly, shifting uncomfortably. I just received word from the FBI. They've executed a search warrant on your home. The room froze. Judge Barnes went pale. What did you just say? His voice, once booming with authority, came out as a whisper. The bailiff swallowed hard before continuing. Agents are currently raiding your personal records at your house and your private office downtown. He hesitated, then added, they've already found evidence of offshore accounts, bribes, and tampered case files. The moment stretched, thick and suffocating. The whispers in the courtroom grew louder. Barnes gripped the edge of his bench so hard his fingers turned white. This is a setup, he barked, slamming his gavel down. I will not tolerate this. Another buzz. Another call. The bailiff checked his earpiece again. His face turned even graver. There's more, he said, glancing at the federal judge now presiding over the case. The agents have also uncovered communication logs, payments made to shell companies, deposits that linked directly to a slow exhale. Then the words that sealed Barnes's fate. Several organized crime syndicates. The gasp that rippled through the courtroom was almost deafening. Clint Eastwood, who had been watching in silence, leaned back in his chair, a knowing smirk playing at his lips. Judge Barnes shot up from his seat so fast that his chair nearly toppled over. His face had turned an ugly shade of red, veins bulging at his temples. You listen to me, he hissed, pointing a trembling finger at the bailiff. This is a political stunt. I am a judge. Do you understand me? I will have your career. He turned on his heel, desperate now, looking for an exit. But two uniformed security officers had already moved to block the doors. For the first time in his long career, Barnes was trapped. The federal judge stood, adjusting his robe with practiced ease. His voice was calm but unforgiving as he addressed the room. Judge Malcolm Barnes, you are now under federal investigation for corruption, obstruction of justice, and abuse of power. Barnes's head snapped toward him, eyes wild. This is insanity. You don't have the right. I have every right, the federal judge cut in, his tone sharp as a blade. And I strongly advise you to remain seated and silent, as anything you say from this point forward can and will be used against you. The entire courtroom watched in awe. They had never seen someone like Barnes, once feared, untouchable, reduced to a cornered animal. Barnes's breathing was uneven. His shoulders trembled with rage, desperation, and something else. Fear. That's when his gaze finally landed on Clint. Clint Eastwood hadn't moved an inch. He sat perfectly still, his expression unreadable, the weight of the moment sitting comfortably on his shoulders. Barnes glared at him with pure hatred. You, he growled under his breath. That was when the federal judge turned to Clint, his brow furrowed slightly, curiosity flickering behind his sharp gaze. Mr. Eastwood, he said, how did you know? Clint exhaled, then stood up, slow and steady. He dusted off his coat, tilting his head slightly as he met Barnes' furious stare. His signature smirk returned. Just had a hunch. Barnes' entire body tensed, his mind racing. If he was going down, he wasn't going down alone. Judge Barnes had spent years commanding a courtroom with nothing but his voice, his power stretching far beyond the wooden bench he sat behind. But now, as he stood frozen in place, eyes darting between the federal judge and the security officers flanking the exit, that power was slipping away, fast. For the first time, Barnes looked afraid. The federal judge cleared his throat, his deep voice carrying over the hushed murmurs in the courtroom. Based on the overwhelming evidence presented today, Judge Malcolm Barnes is hereby suspended from his judicial duties, effective immediately. The words landed like a gavel, cracking through his legacy. Barnes let out a sharp breath, his fists clenching. This is outrageous. His voice cracked with desperation as he turned toward the jury, the spectators, anyone willing to see him as the victim. You're all being played. This is a setup. But nobody met his gaze. The same lawyers who once groveled before him, the same courtroom clerks who jumped at his every demand, were now watching him unravel. The federal judge didn't so much as blink. Your actions will be reviewed for formal disbarment. He nodded toward the security officers. Escort him out. Barnes's breathing turned ragged. His final attempt at resistance came in the form of a growl. I am a judge. Clint Eastwood, who had been watching silently from his seat, finally stood. He adjusted his coat, taking his time before meeting Barnes's gaze. His expression was unreadable, his movements slow, deliberate. Not anymore, you ain't, Clint said simply. The words cut deeper than any legal ruling. A heavy silence filled the room, then the sound of footsteps, deliberate, echoing, final. Barnes was led out of the courtroom, his career officially over. The moment the door shut behind him, it was as if the entire room exhaled at once. The weight of the trial, the years of corruption, had been dragged out into the light. In Clint, he just walked out. No grand speeches, no victory lap, just a man who'd done what he came to do. But the world wasn't going to let him slip away that easily. The second he stepped outside, cameras flashed, reporters lunged. A swarm of journalists encircled him, their voices overlapping in a flurry of questions. Mr. Eastwood, how does it feel to bring down a corrupt judge? What do you say to those who call this a historic moment in legal history? Clint exhaled, amused. He glanced up at the sky, then back at the cameras. He gave a slow, knowing chuckle. Reckon he did that himself. The cameras kept rolling, but Clint had already said his piece. As he walked toward his car, the reporters scrambled for more. But somewhere in the shadows, someone else was watching, someone who wasn't ready to let this end. Judge Barnes sat in his dimly lit chambers, his fingers digging into the mahogany desk. His career was hanging by a thread, but if he was going down, he wasn't going alone. The humiliation, the public disgrace, it burned deep, and there was only one man to blame, Clint Eastwood. Barnes grabbed his phone and dialed a number he'd hoped to never use. The line rang once before a gruff voice answered. "Malcolm," the voice greeted coolly. "I was wondering when you'd call." Barnes exhaled sharply. "I need this case shut down, now." A low chuckle came from the other end. "You're in no position to make demands." Barnes slammed his fist onto the desk. "Don't lecture me. You and I both know that video was illegally obtained. That clerk had no right to leak it. We can have it thrown out, dismantle the case before it reaches federal court." There was a pause, then a measured response. "Tricky, but possible. If we discredit the evidence, we might create reasonable doubt. But you're running out of allies, Judge. Are you sure you want to escalate this?" Barnes's jaw clenched. He had no choice. "Do whatever it takes. I want Eastwood buried." Meanwhile, across town, Clint was getting his own phone call. He was sitting in a quiet diner, nursing a black coffee when his phone vibrated. The number on the screen was one he hadn't seen in years. Clint answered, his voice steady. "Been a long time." On the other end, a familiar voice replied, "Wish I was calling for a friendly catch-up, but I figured you should know. Barnes isn't giving up." Clint smirked, stirring his coffee. "Didn't think he would." The voice continued, "He's pulling strings, trying to get the evidence dismissed. If he succeeds, he might skate." Clint leaned back in his chair, taking a slow sip before responding. "Appreciate the heads up, but tell me something. What are his odds?" A short silence. Then, "Not great, but he's desperate, and desperate men make dangerous moves." Clint nodded to himself. "Good. Neither am I." The next morning, Barnes strode into the courtroom with a new sense of confidence. He had spent the night making calls, securing favors, ensuring that by the time the judge convened, the video evidence would be rendered inadmissible. He walked past the press, their flashing cameras no longer fazing him. He was back in control, or so he thought. As he took his seat, Clint stood. Without a word, he slid a sealed folder across the plaintiff's attorney's table. The lawyer took one glance at the contents before his eyebrows shot up. Barnes noticed the reaction immediately. His stomach twisted. The judge overseeing the case leaned forward. "Mr. Eastwood, is there something you'd like to present?" Clint smirked, finally breaking the silence. "Just a little insurance policy." Barnes's confidence flickered. He had no idea what Clint had just pulled, but he was about to find out. The courtroom was tense, the air thick with anticipation. Judge Barnes sat high on his bench, adjusting his robe with a calculated smirk. He believed he had regained control, that his last desperate moves had secured his position. He cleared his throat, gripping his gavel as he prepared to deliver the final blow. "This court has reviewed the presented evidence," Barnes announced, his voice carrying a false confidence. "And due to certain legal technicalities, I have no choice but to—" A voice cut through the room like a blade, deep, steady, and deliberate. "Check. Your phone, Judge." All eyes turned to Clint Eastwood, who sat calm as ever, his gaze locked onto Barnes. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. Barnes furrowed his brows, confused for the first time. The murmur of the crowd grew louder as the judge hesitated before reaching into his robe pocket. His fingers wrapped around the device, the glow from the screen illuminating his now paling face. His stomach twisted. The subject line of the email read, "Immediate suspension, pending investigation, Federal Judicial Oversight Committee." Barnes's hands shook slightly as he tapped the message open, scanning the contents in growing horror. The courtroom erupted into whispers. Attorneys exchanged stunned glances. Reporters scribbled furiously. and even the bailiff's expression shifted to one of disbelief. The federal judge, who had been quietly observing from the back, now stepped forward, clearing his throat. "This court is no longer yours to control," he announced firmly. "Judge Malcolm Barnes, by order of the Federal Judicial Oversight Committee, you are hereby suspended immediately pending investigation into judicial misconduct and corruption." Barnes gripped the edge of his desk as if trying to anchor himself from the storm that was now crashing down on him. This is ridiculous," he sputtered, his face turning red. "I am a respected judge. I will not—" "You'll do exactly as ordered," the federal judge interrupted coldly. "This case will proceed under my jurisdiction." The tension in the room was suffocating. Barnes, always the one in control, now sat powerless in front of an audience that had once feared him. Clint finally leaned forward, his voice smooth, unwavering. "Looks like your time's up, Judge." Barnes's hand twitched toward his gavel in frustration. He slammed it down hard, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "This isn't over," he barked, his desperation bleeding through every syllable. Clint didn't flinch. Instead, a small smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth as he stood, dusting off his jacket. "Oh," Clint said, his voice laced with finality. "I think it is." Barnes's breathing grew shallow, his chest rising and falling rapidly as the federal judge signaled for security. For the first time in his career, he was being escorted out of his own courtroom. The walls were closing in on Judge Malcolm Barnes, and for the first time in his career, he could feel it. He had always believed himself untouchable, protected by wealth, connections, and a legal system he had spent years manipulating. But as he sat stiffly in the courtroom, his title stripped, the weight of his sins bore down on him like an avalanche. The air was thick with tension as the federal investigator stepped forward, his voice cold and precise. "After reviewing multiple complaints and subpoenaed financial records, we have uncovered extensive evidence of judicial misconduct," he announced. The audience, packed with lawyers, journalists, and everyday citizens who had been victims of Barnes's rulings, held their breath. The investigator turned to the federal judge now overseeing the case. "Judge Barnes has been found guilty of taking bribes from corporate entities, falsifying court documents, and illegally dismissing cases in favor of high-paying defendants." A wave of murmurs spread across the room. Reporters' pens scratched furiously against their notepads. Camera shutters clicked. Clint Eastwood, leaning back in his chair, watched with quiet satisfaction. The federal investigator continued. "Further analysis of Judge Barnes's bank records has revealed offshore accounts containing millions in unreported assets, deposits made by powerful corporations that benefited from his biased rulings." Barnes sat frozen, gripping the table so hard his knuckles turned white. But it wasn't over yet. One by one, other lawyers and former judges stood up, stepping forward like a lineup of witnesses to a public execution. "I was pressured to rule in favor of Barnes's associates," one retired judge confessed. "He threatened me with professional ruin if I didn't play along," a defense attorney admitted. "He's been rigging cases for years," another stated. "If you had money, you walked free. If you didn't, you never stood a chance." The entire courtroom watched as Barnes's legacy crumbled before their eyes. And then came the final blow. The plaintiff's attorney, representing the victims Barnes had ruled against in the fraud case, stood up holding a thick folder. "In addition to the ongoing investigation, we have obtained undeniable proof that Judge Barnes was working directly with the defense in this case," he declared, voice strong and unwavering. He handed a set of printed emails to the federal judge. These exchanges confirmed that Barnes not only planned to dismiss this case, but also advised the defense on how to bury key evidence. A gasp rippled through the room. Barnes tried to speak, but no words came out. His mouth opened and closed, his once booming voice reduced to silence. Clint let out a slow exhale, his signature smirk creeping onto his face. "Didn't even have to draw my gun for this one." Barnes's lawyer, who had been flipping through documents in a panic, suddenly leaned close to him, whispering something under his breath. Barnes stiffened, his face turning ghost white. He just realized prison was now a real possibility. His breathing grew shallow, hands trembling. For years, he had sent men away in handcuffs. Now it might be his turn. Judge Malcolm Barnes had always ruled from his bench with an iron fist, his gavel deciding the fates of countless men and women. But today, the weight of justice was coming down on him. The courtroom door swung open, and the heavy boots of federal marshals echoed through the chamber. The murmurs of reporters, attorneys, and spectators died down, replaced by the tense silence of a man meeting his downfall. Barnes swallowed hard as two agents in dark suits approached, their expressions unreadable. The federal judge presiding over the case adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. His voice was calm, firm, final. "Judge Malcolm Barnes," he announced, "you are hereby stripped of your judicial duties, effective immediately." The words hung in the air like a noose tightening around Barnes's throat. Barnes shot to his feet, his chair screeching against the floor. His once confident smirk had vanished, replaced with wild desperation. "You can't do this! I'm a judge!" His voice cracked as he jabbed a finger at the bench. "This is my courtroom." Clint Eastwood, who had been watching with his usual calm, finally moved. He stood slow and deliberate, adjusting his coat with one hand. His weathered face remained unreadable, but there was something in his eyes. Something cold, something final. "Not anymore, you ain't." Barnes turned to his lawyer, his face red with fury. "Say something. Do something." The lawyer simply closed his briefcase and shook his head. "I'd advise you to remain silent, Your Honor." The last two words dripped with irony. The marshals closed in. Barnes stumbled back, looking around wildly, searching for an ally, a lifeline, anything to save him. But the same courtroom that once hung on his every word now only stared at him with cold fascination. As one of the marshals reached for him, Barnes's composure snapped. He shoved the man's arm away and tried to step back, but the other agent grabbed him by the wrist. "Don't touch me," Barnes barked. "I am—" The marshal snapped the cuffs around his wrists, cutting his words off for good. A collective gasp rippled through the room. The cameras flashed. Reporters scrambled to document the moment. The fall of a man who once believed himself untouchable. Barnes stood there, handcuffed in the very courtroom he once ruled over, his breathing uneven, his face drained of color. And then came the final humiliation. The federal judge leaned forward and spoke, his tone measured and unforgiving. "Take him away." The marshals nodded and escorted Barnes toward the door. As they passed by Clint, Barnes lifted his head, glaring at the man who had brought his empire crashing down. "You think you've won?" Barnes hissed under his breath. Clint barely glanced at him. "Nah, I think justice did." Barnes's scowl deepened as he was led out of the room, the courtroom doors slamming shut behind him. The second he was gone, the silence broke. Reporters rushed forward, cameras rolling, microphones shoved toward Clint. One journalist, a woman with sharp eyes and a notepad clutched in her hand, made it through the crowd first. "Mr. Eastwood," she called, "any final words about bringing down Judge Barnes?" Clint paused. A slow, amused chuckle rumbled from his throat as he tipped his hat. Told him he didn't want to do this. The reporters exploded with questions, but Clint was already walking away. His job here was done. Judge Barnes sat on the thin metal bench of his cold gray holding cell, his hands clasped together, fingers trembling. The walls around him were bare, the air thick with the stench of sweat and regret. His once pristine suit was now wrinkled, his tie loosened as if it was choking him, or maybe that was just the weight of his downfall pressing down on his chest. Across from him, a small television screen flickered, mounted high in the corner of the cell. The news played, the anchor's voice cold and matter-of-fact. Breaking news: Judge Malcolm Barnes officially removed from the bench after shocking bribery scandal. Federal prosecutors confirm additional charges may follow. And in a twist no one saw coming, Hollywood legend Clint Eastwood played a crucial role in the case. Barnes's stomach twisted. He clenched his jaw, watching as images of himself in handcuffs flashed across the screen, his mug shot now a public spectacle. The same cameras that once framed him as an untouchable figure of authority now broadcasted his humiliation to the world. The next segment showed his estate, his grand, sprawling mansion. Federal agents combed through the property, seizing assets, hauling out files, freezing his accounts. Everything he had built, everything he had hoarded through corruption and greed, gone in a single day. Barnes buried his face in his hands, his breath shallow. Meanwhile, outside the courthouse, Clint Eastwood walked down the steps, unfazed. The crowd of reporters swarmed him, their microphones shoved forward, their voices overlapping. "Mr. Eastwood, how does it feel, taking down a corrupt judge? Did you know all along that Barnes was dirty? Are you planning to go after more corrupt officials?" Clint didn't break stride. He simply tipped his hat, giving them a sideways smirk as he moved toward his car. Before he could open the door, a young lawyer in a crisp suit stepped forward, eyes wide with admiration. "Sir," the young man blurted, almost breathless, "I just want to say, you're a legend." Clint paused, looking the kid up and down. Then with a small chuckle, he shook his head. "Nah," he said, voice low and steady, "just a man who don't like cheaters." With that, Clint climbed into his car, shutting the door behind him. As he reached for the ignition, the radio crackled to life. And in other news, the anchor announced, a new corruption task force is being formed, directly inspired by today's historic trial. Clint smirked, his fingers tapping the steering wheel. His work here? It was done.